Welcome to the studio and to this panel discussion, Return to Office, Magnet or a Mandate? Well, I'm delighted. I've got a great panel here. Let me introduce everyone briefly. We have Gerard McGovern, the Director of Digital at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Kieran Higgins, Head of Digital Workplace Transformation at Cisco. Elizabeth Akorita, Deputy Director, Digital Delivery, Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. And Connor Whelan, the CIO and the COO of Experience. So welcome to you all. Just like to get your quick thoughts on that title of that panel, Mandate or Magnet? Anyone kick it off? Gerard.
I think with everything in life, it's not a binary answer. I think it very much depends on the type of organization you have and maybe actually the type of organization you want to be. So what might work well for one organization isn't going to work for another. But I think everything should be rooted in what outcomes are you looking for? I think the pandemic showed us that obviously there was a lot of bad in the pandemic, but it did show us we can work differently and in a lot of cases still produce the same outcomes. So it was an opportunity to think about how we could work, but it very much comes down to what does your organization feel and look like, and make sure that whatever you do, you're still maintaining that same outcome, that still same level of staff productivity that you had before the pandemic and carrying it on forwards.
What's it like at Cisco? It would be interesting to hear.
It's interesting. Obviously, we've a vested interest in the technology on both sides of that, both in the office and remote. I think the technology during the pandemic was better than anybody expected it to be. And I think workloads and jobs that we thought couldn't be done remotely were, and they were successful. And it changed the way people were working for such a long time that they became very accustomed to it. So trying to unwind that or put the genie back in the bottle is a very, very difficult thing to do.
Absolutely. Elizabeth, what's your experience been?
With the kind of push versus pull, I guess. So,
and how did it change? Because I suppose the pendulum swung really when COVID hit, and then we all reassessed because we couldn't go back into the office at that moment. So that was really the moment of change. So how has it been at your organisation?
So in Gov, we were always quite flexible. We were not in the office 5 days a week, even before the pandemic. We did luck out with the timing somewhat because we were doing a bit of a soft launch of Teams. So we already had kind of good data for what worked and what didn't. And then when everything hit and we could have closed down very, very suddenly, within about 12 hours, I think we had it kind of rolled out throughout a couple of hundred people within the digital team, then rolled out to thousands of people in the wider team. So we were physically able to work in that way. And we've tried to just be really pragmatic. Look at the data, look at what worked and what didn't, and keep the best of what worked, and then adjust and iterate what didn't.
And now, what's it like? You said you were already working from home before the pandemic. So has that? Do people work from home more since the pandemic?
So we're more flexible. We're officially hybrid. We aim for about 2 days work from home and then about 3 days not. But then 3 days kind of not being at home can be things like being at conferences, doing training. You don't literally have to be in the office for 3 days. We try and be kind of really flexible about it.
Interesting. Connor?
Yeah, it's similar to Gerard's response, really. It's not a binary response. We're a global organisation, so there's a natural degree of hybrid working in that model anyway, pre-pandemic. And we've got different functions that physically have to be in the office for a variety of reasons. Some of it's operational, some of it's regulatory. But we're trying to find a balance because very similar to Elizabeth, we are a hybrid organisation, no mandate. And we allow people to have flexibility depending on the part of the organisation they're in. We're trying to find balance, so we're being fair across the organisation is something that we're very conscious about. So we can explain to people the operating model that we adopt across different parts of the organisation.
Do you think that if there is no mandate, it makes it very difficult for teams to come together? Because if there is no mandate, how do you collaborate? What's the method?
I think it helps to be clear about what we mean by collaboration, because I feel like that can be a little bit of a buzzword to say we want people in to collaborate, but for example, in government, we're decentralising and pushing people away from London, for example, limiting the number of jobs we can even advertise in London, because we have an agenda called Places for Growth, where we want to disperse jobs throughout the country to enrich the entire country. So if we're saying collaborate on what outcome, as we've talked about outcomes before, because if someone comes in to collaborate, but the rest of their team is in Wales or Scotland, are they collaborating? They're sitting on teams, so you have to kind of think a bit more practically.
No, that's fair, absolutely. Do you think then that the whole purpose of the office and what it means to be in the office has completely evolved?
I think it should evolve. I'd imagine there's some organisations where once the restrictions were lifted, just went back to exactly how they were. But I think for that point of collaboration Elizabeth raised, I don't think there's a lot of value just coming into the office to sit at a desk. There has to be more there. And therefore, I think the spaces within an office need to change, that it's not just even about a meeting room, it's about those ad hoc places, grabbing a quick catch up with someone. I don't think sitting at a desk, and particularly sitting at an assigned desk, is probably conducive to, if you are going to come into the office, I don't think that's a really good use of your time. But I think the broader point is, it's referencing back to outcomes. What these mandates or magnets shouldn't be is a replacement for robust line management, good HR policies. If a team isn't performing, and whether that's through collaborating or outcomes, I don't think simply dragging them into the office is going to be the solution. And I don't think it should be used that way either.
How does it work at the Tony Blair Institute? So are people in the office X days a week?
We're very much hybrid. We're based across 40 countries. So even if everyone every day came to the office, you still would not meet all of your colleagues. And I think, as you were saying about that, there are certain roles that do need to be in an office. There's certain ones that don't. We have people traveling all over the world. It was a problem. No, problem's not the right word. It was something we had to do before the pandemic. As Elizabeth said, government was working, people working from home before then. I think what's happened is, through tools, through technologies such as the one Cisco provide, the ability to feel closer and collaborate more is better than it's ever been. So we definitely take advantage of those technologies.
Then what is the motivation from an employer's perspective to want to get people back into the office, do you think?
I think it's mixed in that, and it depends per employer and what the actual enterprise does. But I mean, in some ways, people have a lot of investment in real estate, and they go, okay, how do I get that back? How can I justify having it? Because it's quite expensive. And they think, well, I need to do that. And then the other piece is, I guess, a hierarchical management structure where they feel like I have to see the people there to know that they're working, which is a bit old-fashioned, but also, I guess, it's the way certain organizations work. Now, you know, in the various companies I get to talk to and peers I get to interact with, the ones that talk about the Great Resign are probably also the ones that have set a mandate, and they tend to struggle a little bit with that.
Can you go into that a bit more? Can you give any examples?
Well, you know, we in good faith, all of our employees changed the way they worked in order to deliver the outcomes everybody's been talking about. And then to turn that around and say, you need to unwind that, come back into the office and do what we know you can do at home, and which you change your whole way of working and way of living. So people just are voting with their feet.
And to what extent, and we talked about this just before this started, but to what extent do you think this depends on where you are in your career? Because, you know, at a certain stage, you want to learn, you're eager to learn, you're thirsty to be in the office to learn from your peers or from your boss. Yeah. And at a certain stage, you want to do your job, but you also have other priorities going on. So it's very much dependent on where you are.
It is. I mean, we've done a lot of research on it, and I think what we've seen is a trend, specifically process-based roles can be done really well remotely for a long period of time. But anything creative or anybody early in career tends to want to be in the office where they can interact with their peers and with other people. Very often the people who actually aren't that keen to be in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think from personal experience also, it depends when you have younger people in the team and they may be flat sharing, so therefore there are 3 of them working from home and it's not really conducive to doing any productive work. So there are actually practical factors that would, impact their decision making as well.
I think that's a really important point, that there will always be a need for office space. But I think and to your point about maybe CEOs or COOs seeing it as, well, we have this space, we have to use it. I think that's classic sunk cost fallacy, that if you're bringing people into the office and actually your productivity is either not improving or actually going down because you had a very happy workforce and now they're being forced to come in there to effectively use something you've bought, that doesn't make sense from a business perspective. But it is a real challenge. How do you deal with multi-generations across the workforce, different levels of experience? But again, I think it's something that was there before. I think it's now been highlighted when people aren't in the office. But I think for a lot of organizations, that was always the case. I think now we probably have more technologies that make it easier to do that. But it's not just technology. It's about making sure that you obviously want your people who've just joined to go through a very good career. And that's why it's about line management. It's about leadership. It's not simply an office or a technological solution.
Yeah, but when I think back to being a graduate and I started off in investment banking, if I hadn't been in the office every day when I had a ton of questions every day on how to make my balance sheet balance, or what's the process for X, or getting a presentation done, it would have been really difficult to do my job, actually. So I think that problem has always existed, but actually when people were in the office 5 days a week or 4 days a week, it was very easy in that sense. So how do you address the challenge of wanting to teach sort of the graduates or the youngsters? That's quite difficult, actually, if you're not in the office, and you can collaborate, but actually it's not exactly the same as putting your head over the desk and saying, oh, Kieran, I don't know how to do this. Can you come and show me? How do you get around that?
We've looked at this hard. We have apprentices, graduates, younger generations in the organisation, and all the age categories. And it's a team game. So we've really explained, to your point, the challenge of how does the younger generation learn and interact. And we buddy people up. We have mentoring systems. We look at the teams and we talk to the teams and say, we talk to the line manager of the teams and say, you really need to think about everybody in your team. And it's a very different proposition from pre-pandemic. And we allow the teams the flexibility to discuss it as a team and work it through. But it's very important, we say, that you need a high degree of physical interaction for the younger generations or people entering a new role who's trying to pick something up new. So it's not just a generative thing, it's a role challenge as well. So just trying to be grown up about it and ask people for the feedback, what's working, what's not working. So test and learn was a common phrase we used at Experian because we're breaking new ground and have been since the pandemic.
Well, how do you feel about that, Elizabeth? You were talking about the fact that obviously you're trying to get people out of London, but what impact does that have on people who are just starting their careers or, to Connor's point, changing roles?
Yeah, so I think it's something that I kind of agree with the earlier point, that it is easy to forget once you get to a certain point in your career, what it felt like to be at the very beginning and how much kind of a human sponge you were just in the office, even passively overhearing all those conversations, and you just learn so much without even realizing that you were learning. So I think that is valuable. So I think it just really needs to be structured. That's how we approach it. So when we know we have an intake of a certain number of very new, very young people, we get them together for an orientation day, introduce them to the senior managers, our digital director, for example. We make sure that they physically go to things like away days so that they get to kind of meet the team as soon as possible. They can kind of meet people, shake hands, and they're not sending Teams message to faceless people like, hello, to your point, can you help me with such and such? I have no idea who you are, but help. And we do try to get teams together on particular days. So if we know a particular team has a couple of new starters, we might get them all together, say on a Wednesday recurring, so they can just have a bit of structure and predictability, so they know there are at least some opportunities for them to be around people, be little sponges and just absorb.
And what feedback, do you get feedback on that? Because then that would just be 1 day a week, but then you're still on your own for 4 days a week and you're still relatively, green in your career. What feedback have you had on that?
So people aren't kind of left to their own devices. We do have, for example, a buddy system and lots of other ways that we pair people with a named person, so they're really never actually left on their own. We do look at the data, what is and isn't working, and if we do get that verbal feedback that anything isn't working or is impeding anyone's development, we would either give them very structured development or kind of change tack.
It's funny, Wednesday seems to be like a magic day. That's the day we've picked as well. And I think it's because it's midweek.
Yeah.
But what we try to do is clear all meetings that day. So it's a totally interactive, collaborative day.
That's a great day.
So people just go in to be in there. And then something that was driven by our early in careers was for the alternate days, they've built this app that basically works with calendar to work out who's going to be in. So you say, my intent is to be in on Thursday. So then they can track people that they want to interact with and know that they're going to be in on that day and plan around that. So
Elizabeth had a really good point about instant messaging, and we saw something at my previous organisation that for people who were just starting, instant messaging worked really well because you could ask those questions, but also for the people who are answering them, they found it very valuable because they may not necessarily answer the question straight away. So it may be they answer 2 or 3 minutes later, but it meant they could, effectively, if they're working on something, they can compartmentalize and go, right, I'm going to finish this. Now I'm going to answer the question, which obviously if you're in an office environment, you go up to someone, your thought has been broken by that point. Now, there's other benefits as well, you face-to-face, etc. But I think it's, coming back to what we were saying at the start, there's many different ways to achieve the same outcomes. It has to be that balance. Yeah. And it is very much organisation dependent. But I think it's thrown up, or it's highlighted issues that were always there, but now they're very much in our faces and going, okay, we have to solve these problems now. Whereas I think there was always an assumption, if you're in the office, it's a good thing you're working, to your point about bosses who like to see everyone there. Just because someone's in the office, you don't actually know they're working. Actually, if they're at home, the only thing you can really judge people on is what they produce.
Yeah.
So from some respects, line management is a little bit easier when that's one of the only metrics you've got.
Let's talk a bit about that. How do you manage people then effectively if they're not in the office?
I think it's very much outcome driven. That's a consistent theme you're seeing across the sofas. So it's about what is the business outcome you're trying to drive, and do you mind what hours of the day the people do that? You know, they may have caring duties, they may have other things they're trying to get done, they may have hobbies, right? But if they're getting the outcomes delivered, you shouldn't really mind. So that's basically, I think, the key to it. You're getting your business outcomes.
I fully agree. I think it's given people more flexibility. We've struggled a lot with flexible working. When someone says, I want a certain day off of the week, and that's hard when you're running operational routines, but people want flexibility in their hours of working. That's so much easier if you adopt the outcome model, and that's something we've really pushed forward, and we've had a lot of positive feedback from the workforce that they really like that. So I think that's one thing that we're focusing on. The second thing is the way you check in. One thing we talked a lot about on the remote working was, do we have cameras on or off?
Oh.
It was a big discussion.
You opened up the can of worms.
Depends if you're messaging someone when someone's talking a really long time on the call.
Exactly. So we said for big Teams calls, you've got flexibility, but if it's one-on-one, it has to be camera on.
Yeah.
You've got to try and get as close to simulating a face-to-face meeting. And that, again, was an interesting discussion, and some people were uncomfortable, and it exposed other areas where people weren't necessarily in the room, actually in the meeting. So I think you have
to be... As in they were logged on but not on.
Yeah, or not necessarily taking notice, quite frankly.
The only thing I'd say on my previous organisation was guide dogs, which meant a lot of our employees were visually impaired. Yeah. So the camera debate was an interesting one, and there were two lenses, deliberate pun intended, of which to look through it, that I think it is more engaging when you're able to see, but obviously people who don't have that option. What we did find, which was very interesting, was the idea that if someone who was visually impaired had their camera on, it actually was more useful for seeing those reactions, seeing the things that unfortunately people who are visually impaired can't see. But it's that idea of, I think as well, there are some people who are just not comfortable having their camera on. And I think there has to be that balance of that would be the ideal if everyone could see everything, but we're not in that ideal state for various different reasons. But I think it's, as with everything, it's a balance.
Yeah, just to kind of caveat that, I think it's important to note that in addition to kind of certain physical impairments like blindness, there's also neurodivergence. So for example, we can't assume that people should have cameras on, making eye contact, etc. For example, if someone is autistic, that might be difficult for them. So in our team, we are very, very flexible. People can make the choice if they have cameras on or off for that reason. People's housing, as we touched on, is very different. If they've got a couple of kids running around in the background or various housing things, they might not want their camera on for sensitivity reasons, so we let them have it off.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly true that COVID has made a lot of things acceptable that weren't previously acceptable in the workplace. I don't ever remember talking about needing to pick up my children from school. There were lots of things that were taboo.
Yeah.
And like to your point about flexible working and how it's worked, not if people take a day off, but say, I'll still deliver. But, it's been, I think, for a lot of people, a huge relief that they can be a bit more human in the workplace. Has that been your experience?
I agree, because we love seeing kids on camera. We love seeing pets on camera. It brings a nice bit of light-hearted, nature and themes to some of the conversations. So we encourage people to try and be themselves and not to worry about there's a bit of noise in the background. You can manage that.
Yeah.
You've got noise in the office.
Yeah,
when you're in the office, there's lots of distractions. So we're just trying to be flexible and to see what works. There are certain means you might need to be a bit more focused and a bit more disciplined, but I think on the whole, we try and just let people be who they want. And technology has been great because you can blur backgrounds and put your own little virtual office up, and people have now got avatars and people trying to make a bit of fun out of it. So there is definitely an evolving, I think, world out there in that whole hybrid space.
And I think there's a kind of a social contract as well in that what we saw during COVID, which we were kind of surprised at, with managers say, well, how do we know people are working? We actually looked at the hours. People were working more hours than they were when they were. And the commute just got gobbled up. Yep. So, I mean, if the least we could do is give people back that commute time so that they can use it in personal space, then that's great.
That's great. I agree.
I think for your question about how do you manage and lead remotely, I think coming back to everything everyone said here, it's trust. If you look at any employment survey, what do people want? They want trust, autonomy, and very basically to be treated like adults. And what you said there about being able to be more human, be able to effectively express their personality more, that's what people ask for. And I'm adamant that these mandates or the idea of enforcing wherever you work, it can't be a substitute for really good line management and leadership. If your team aren't performing, simply dragging them into the office is not going to solve that problem. It's a much larger problem than that.
Yeah, you're solving the wrong problem, basically, aren't you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I completely agree about the trust issue. I don't know how trustworthy I was when I was 20. This is the challenge.
But you didn't live through the pandemic at that time, and I think we adjust, don't we, in these circumstances.
Yeah. Do you think there are any industries or sectors where, we've talked about specific roles where you do really need to be in the office, but are there any industries or sectors where it doesn't really work to be remote, where or it's not acceptable, or you just need to be in the office? Or do you think it's been a sea change across industries?
I think in government it's really interesting because some of the stuff we do is literally like top secret, sensitive, and so you have to be in a particular building or bit of a building to get it done. And then I think you've said a piece about fairness. We do try to consider that some roles do have to be in our IT. Tech support has to be on-site, facilities people have to be on-site, etc. But where we physically can have that flexibility, we do try to.
Yeah, I think we find agile development is difficult, particularly with earlier in career developers, if we can't get them together on a reasonably regular basis. It doesn't mean all the time, but and anything, given where we are, anything creative tends to really, really need that interaction on a fairly regular basis.
That was a light bulb moment for some of our teams when we were allowed to come back in a couple of years ago to the office and they were able to co-create together. They said the speed in which we were able to do that was just, a big differential. And so there was no mandate needed. People wanted to come back and they said, God, we can just get things done quicker.
And I think that defines what the future of the office is. It's more of an event center rather than a place you go to do email, right? It's basically you go in there to try and achieve a specific goal and you look forward to it before you go in, and you're thinking about the next time you go back when you leave. So.
I agree. We've refurbed every office and changed them into collaboration spaces.
Every office?
Every single office. We've got rid of a lot of our offices, and we've created these collaboration centres. Nobody's got an office anymore, from the CEO down, open plan with a lot of collaboration spaces, because that's what we want to bring people to the office to do, to collaborate. To Jared's point earlier, if you come into the office just to sit on your computer every day, there's not a lot of value for the individual or the organisation, I'd argue.
So the only caveat, and I'm going to now caveat the only thing I've said to Elizabeth's point about people who are neurodivergent, who maybe some people just want to be in that office. So actually, I'm going to undo what I've said, that sometimes if people feel more comfortable sitting in an office, go for it. I can 100% say I'm stealing that event centre description of an office. That is fantastic. Thank you.
Can I ask, how successful has that been? It's really striking that you've changed every office. What feedback have you had, and how has it worked out? So
we let the employees do the talking, so to speak. So we're part of the Great Place to Work survey. And the last 2 years, our numbers have just gone up and up and up and continue to increase. And people just love the environment, love the ability to love the greater access to people when they come into office. They can go and talk to the CEO in the corner if they want to, or they can go and talk to their colleagues over in the new collaboration space. We've had phenomenal feedback. The one caveat, if we're going to start using caveats, what's hard is half a team in the office, half a team working hybrid.
Yeah.
And I still think there's work we need to get from the tech industry to help us in that environment with better two-way communication on remote versus hybrid. And that's something that I know there's a lot of work in the industry, but any advances we can make there is going to benefit, because I think we're always going to have those scenarios. We try and avoid them, but it's inevitable, I think.
Yeah, I think, and there's a whole bunch of research that says it's over 90% of meetings are going to have at least one remote participant going forward. Yeah. And we have to find a way to democratize that relationship so that it's equal on both sides.
I agree.
And what about the productivity since you've made those changes? Have you noticed, or have you measured it?
We do measure it. We don't lead on it, but we do measure it. And our productivity has gone up 20%. Our engineering community productivity, and we're a software engineering business predominantly, 20% improvement.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Are there any other creative measures that any of you have implemented or seen implemented that you think could work really well, managing this shift that we're all going through at the moment?
I thought that was an interesting point there, where you were talking about having just one person on video, kind of looking a bit lonely. We do try to have either all online or all in person, just to make it fairer, kind of doing that democratization piece. And just to speak to your point about the office refurb, I will say that was really reassuring to hear that worked so well, because the government is taking a similar strategy of rationalising down the number of offices. Our team will be moving deeper into Whitehall in a brand new refurb that's built around collaboration. So I will say it was really heartening to hear that kind of approach can work so well.
I think it's the little things that count. So we talked to the teams about, what do you want the office of the future to be? What type of technology do you want in there? And little things like the screen sizes, little things around my keyboard and my mouse. I'd like a keyboard and a mouse. So we gave the people the option to say, buy a second one. If you want to bring that with you, because people didn't want one on a desk that they reused if it was multiple people using the same equipment. So we really created focus groups and say, these are the different types of scenarios we're trying to think through. You guys make the call, because you've got to help your colleagues and be the ambassadors about how we've made this decision. It's not the tech guys that have made the call. So that was nice to see people taking some involvement and some accountability in those decisions.
When I was at Guide Dogs, we didn't frame it on office or home. We framed it on the basis of, to Elizabeth's point, being able to work from anywhere. Now, we obviously had people who work with dogs, work in the office, work in various different places. But I think if you frame it that way, that now, thanks to technology, you really do have the ability to work from absolutely anywhere. That then doesn't make it that binary. You're either in the office, you're at home. You could be, so for instance, it's fantastic being here at Abbey Road Studios. I know after this, I can go in, I can fire up my laptop and just do a very quick little bit, even jump on a call if I want to. And that has accelerated massively since the pandemic. So it's about, you can actually do your job from anywhere, but you need to be cognizant of all the things that we've highlighted so far.
You really couldn't have driven a change like that any other way. because it was like we jumped forward 10 years in 10 months. And if you tried to actually get people to do that, you wouldn't have been able to. It's one of the, I guess, positive things that came out of a terribly negative thing that happened in the world. But
it was very much a forced change. We have no choice but to do it.
It was a forced change, but everybody bought into it.
And we took probably 5 steps forward, and we probably need to take about 1 step back, because we discovered no one ever wants to do a team quiz on Zoom ever again. But we
had some team parties as well.
Enforced fun definitely does not work as any team building activity. But let's keep the bits that worked, and then evolve or lose those that didn't.
Yeah, and Kieran, I've actually been curious to ask you, as a tech company, do you think you were slightly ahead of the pack before COVID, or where did you stand, and how are you now?
A little bit like Elizabeth said, we were very flexible anyway. And I think what we did have, there was an advantage, was we had our remote set up really well orchestrated. Security was really good. We had high video usage, but it did change. So what we saw email trended down a little bit. Messaging is basically how all of our work gets done now. And then the creative piece, we did see them suffer, and we know that we need to try and bolster the tech to do that, but also get them to spend more time in event centres, right? So
it's a great phrase, event centres. I love it.
All right, well, I think we're probably out of time, but thank you for such a great discussion. And if there are any questions from the audience, we'd be very happy to take them. Yes.
Hi, Jodie at Tara Partners. Thank you very much. Really interesting discussion. I enjoyed listening to that. One thing I have a slight concern about going forward is the sort of health and mental health of people who spend a lot of time potentially on their own. I think that's one of the really good things that the office would provide is companionship.
Yeah.
I know from my point of view, being married with 3 children and a dog, I still struggled in that enforced period where some of my decisions were, do I work in the kitchen or the dining room today? So my concern going forward for organisations is what that means for employees who spend a lot of time on their own, and what is everybody going to do about it?
Could everyone on this side hear that question? Yeah. Okay. Who would like to? Okay.
Everybody go. Right? It's interesting because I'd like to think we wouldn't force anybody to work from home. We've given people the flexibility, but slight tangent to your question. We've opened up a broader market to attract people now, because we're recruiting from anywhere around the world if people want to work remotely. And that was the talent pool we didn't have access to. So there is that demographic of people in the organisation. But to the point earlier, we buddy up. So people we think are vulnerable, we give them buddies. We've got a lot of mental health first aiders in our organisation, and we've created all the access group. We team up with a lot of the charity organisations as well to give people the assistance. But I think the buddy and the line managers have had a lot of support to ensure that there's regular check-ins with people, and we spot where people are struggling, and we give them the assistance.
I think there will always be a place for the office for actually the exact reasons that you've highlighted, but the issues you've highlighted, I think, are part of a good organisation anyway, that you look after your staff, you ensure their mental well-being, irrespective of whether it's being at home, whatever it is. So I think obviously the pandemic has highlighted that very broadly, but I would like to have hoped that organisations had that in place before to cope with whatever would happen to their team members. But I'd like to think going forward, they absolutely definitely have it now, because it is a real issue, and it's something that will only, if nothing is done, will only become worse.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's good policy and practice, because the flip side of that was that if you're an introvert, it actually worked a lot better for some people, and they would like to maintain that going forward. So I think it's good policy and practice with working with your HR partners and building a plan for it going forward.
I think you wanted to say something, Elizabeth, as well.
Yeah, I just think there's an interesting point there about psychological safety of different personality types and physical and cognitive ability. Some people feel more psychologically safe in the workplace versus at home, but I think you need to let the data and the people do the talking and adjust your environment accordingly.
Yes.
A quick question, particularly given where we're filming from, and this is a very practical question. So do you provide any of your folks with any guidance on how to appear in front of the camera, lighting. For a lot of people, it's the quality of the sound that makes a big difference. I've been on so many calls where there's a silhouette or you can hardly hear. There's the big debate about whether you use your home Wi-Fi or whether it should be a wired connection. Just all of that, because we give training to folks, we used to, on lots of really fundamental things like when you go into the office, this is where you sign in, etc. But it seems to be, nobody's really and if we all look around where we are right now, there's quite a lot that goes into producing sort of good content that you can relax and also leaning in and etc. and get that kind of engagement. I'm just wondering, it's very practical.
We do, and it was something we started building during the pandemic, and it was things like even how to do lighting, not to have a window behind you, but then there was also practical things around security, mixing through your own home network versus a dedicated network. So we try to provide the right tools and the setup so that basically it's plug and play. And if they want to keep it separate from their own network, we try and facilitate that. So that's more the technical side of it, but just the practical pieces as well, we did do that.
I think you've raised a really, really interesting point. And I think part of it comes from technology is now so ubiquitous. If you go back 30 years ago, people would say, oh, I don't know how to use Word, Excel, PowerPoint. I've never used it before. We're now at the point where practically anyone can pick up a laptop. But you're spot on that this is relatively new for a lot of people, and that advice should absolutely be there. I think there's also an element of, I know with colleagues have told me, I can't hear you, things like that. So there's a lot of feedback. But you're right, there should be, and we don't have it, I'll be open, we don't have that guidance. But prompted by your question, we're absolutely going to have it now because it's a really, really good point.
It's such a good point, but it feels like it's so obvious that we should have all had this guidance from the beginning, because how many years have we all been on Zoom for? I mean, and now we don't even want to be on Zoom, but it's such a good point. I don't think we ever had that guidance. And then it's very awkward to say, oh, I can't read. If you don't know someone very well, it's quite awkward to tell them actually half your face is hidden by that light or whatever it is. That's a great point.
It's an interesting one, because I think, depending on the individual and how confident they are in front of the camera, some people, that might be a strategy they've deployed. So I think you have to have some flexibility. I think a lot of people have had media training, and those that have had media training know how to present themselves on a camera, and they have their own lighting at home. It's amazing how many people ran out and bought themselves some extra lighting. But so I think that's one side of it. I think the technology side of it is critical, and having standards so that you've got the right clarity of sound and speakers. So we issue headsets, noise cancelling headsets, whether they're pods or wired ones, and people have different preferences, because some people don't like them in their ears all day, some people like them on the outside. So we've got a whole digital workplace team who are focusing on that. And I think that's something that I'm not sure it's completely ubiquitous. We've seen lots of challenges of different technologies not interoperating with, whether it's WebEx or Teams or Zoom. And that's a challenge, because there are competing technologies. And if you're an organization that you've got clients that use different technologies, getting both platforms to, co-create and collaborate is hard. So I've got an ask of the industry to try and get some standards across the platforms so we can make that a better immersive experience for everybody. But the technology, there's still work to be done.
I think that is the end of the panel discussion. So please join me in thanking our excellent panel. Thank you.